The rushes covering the floor have not been changed in years. Beneath them lies a compressed archaeology of human filth, bones, vomit, rat droppings, fish scraps, dried ale, dog urine, and substances that a 16th-century Dutch scholar would later declare unfit to name. The room smells of wood smoke, unwashed wool, fermenting grain, and something older, something that has been decomposing slowly beneath the feet of everyone who has walked through this door for the better part of a decade. A fire crackles in the center of the room, not in a fireplace against a wall, but in the middle of the floor, because chimneys have not yet become standard in buildings like this one. Smoke drifts upward and spreads laterally, clinging to the low ceiling, stinging eyes, settling into hair and clothing, and mixing with the heavy sweetness of ale that has been fermenting somewhere nearby. This is not a reconstruction. This is not an approximation. This is what the scholar Erasmus described when he wrote about English floors in terms that still produce nausea 6 centuries later. White clay, he noted, covered with rushes, occasionally renewed, but so imperfectly that the bottom layer remained undisturbed sometimes for 20 years, harboring expectoration, vomiting, the leakage of dogs and men, ale droppings, scraps of fish, and in his precise Latin phrasing, other abominations not fit to be mentioned. When Erasmus, a man who lived in an age entirely without antibiotics, indoor plumbing, or municipal sanitation, tells posterity that something is too disgusting to describe, the assessment deserves trust. The year is 1340. The door to a medieval English tavern has just swung open, and the evening that unfolds inside will be unlike anything a modern sensibility can comfortably absorb. The year matters with an urgency that the people inside this room cannot yet comprehend. England in 1340 occupies a narrow, volatile corridor of history, wedged between two of the worst catastrophes the island has ever endured. The Great Famine ended barely 23 years earlier, a disaster of such ferocity that King Edward II himself stopped at St. Albans in August of 1315, and could not find bread for himself and his entourage. The King of England, with the full weight of royal logistics behind him, unable to eat. That famine began when 2 consecutive summers of cold, relentless rain destroyed harvests across northern Europe. Wheat prices rose by more than 300%. Peasants in the winter of 1315 to 1316 were driven to eat the seed grain they had reserved for the following spring's planting, which in turn devastated the next year's crop and extended the catastrophe into a third punishing year. According to contemporary chronicles, the famine drove some communities to open the graves of the newly dead and claim the bodies as food. Cannibalism, documented by multiple independent sources across northern Europe, was not metaphor. It was survival arithmetic, applied to a population that had exhausted every other option. That famine lingers in the bodies and memories of the older patrons sitting in this tavern tonight. Some of them lived through it as children. The fear of hunger is not theoretical for these people. It is biographical, and in 8 years, something immeasurably worse is coming. The Black Death will reach England's southern shores in the summer of 1348, carried by fleas on rats aboard trading vessels from the continent. It will kill an estimated 1.5 million people out of a total population of roughly 4 million by 1350, an average loss hovering near 40% of the entire country. Nobody in this room knows this. Nobody on this island knows this. Across the continent, the Mongol army besieging Kaffa on the Crimean coast has already begun catapulting the corpses of plague-infected soldiers over the city walls in what historians consider one of the earliest recorded instances of biological warfare. Genoese traders fleeing that city by ship are unknowingly carrying the bacterium Yersinia pestis westward across the Mediterranean. A contemporary writer who survived the plague later described its transmission as spreading from the ill to the healthy, like fire among dry or oily materials. It could be communicated not only through speaking or associating with the sick, but even by touching their clothing. But that catastrophe belongs to the future. Tonight, in 1340, the stew is simmering, the ale is flowing, and the floor beneath every patron's feet is quietly composting. The first thing that strikes any visitor to this space is the smell, not the noise. The open hearth fire in the center of the room has been burning for hours, pumping wood smoke directly into the enclosed living area. Layered onto that base note is the scent of unwashed human bodies, because bathing in 14th century England is infrequent, inconsistent, and surrounded by medical suspicion. Some physicians of the era actively warned that opening the pores through bathing invited disease. Deodorant will not be invented for another 5 centuries. Add the floor itself, the Erasmus carpet of decomposing organic matter, and the air inside the tavern achieves a density of odor that modern experience cannot easily simulate. Factor in the street outside where the smell is arguably worse. Towns in 1340 are packed with horses, donkeys, cattle, and livestock being driven to slaughter, all of them contributing to roads that function, by modern sanitary standards, as open sewers. Pigs roam freely through the streets, serving as living garbage disposals that consume kitchen scraps, human waste, and whatever else they encounter. According to contemporary records, this sanitation role was considered so valuable that pigs penetrated almost everywhere except the private chambers of lords and ladies. The air outside is saturated with the byproducts of this arrangement. The air inside is merely a warmer, darker, and slightly sweeter version of it, tinged with the fermenting grain scent of ale in various stages of readiness. The room itself bears no resemblance to the cozy wooden interiors that modern fantasy has projected onto the medieval tavern. In a village, the word tavern simply referred to the home of whoever happened to be brewing at the time, a domestic space temporarily pressed into commercial service. Even in a town, the tavern amounts to someone's converted home. The hearth dominates the center because cooking in most households throughout the Middle Ages happened on an open fire in the middle of the main living area. Kitchen and dining hall occupy the same room. There are no separate stations, no bar, no counter. There is a fire, there is a large iron pot hanging above it, and there are people arranged around it in rough approximations of seating. A drink is the first order of business, because that is why every person in this room has come, and because the beverage landscape of 14th century England contains surprises that even careful students of the period find striking. In 1340, the alcoholic drink options available in England number exactly 2: ale and wine. That is the complete list. Beer as a modern drinker would recognize it does not exist here yet. According to historians, beer made a remarkably late entry into English history, arriving only in the latter half of the 14th century. Between roughly 1350 and 1400, every drop of beer consumed on English soil was imported from the Netherlands. The first documented evidence of anyone actually brewing beer in England dates to 1398 or 1399, when a Dutchman was fined for purchasing wheat to produce it. Distilled spirits are similarly absent. An alchemist has recently discovered how to distill alcohol somewhere in continental Europe, but the process remains confined to producing medicines and is known to almost nobody in England. The choices tonight are ale and wine, and since taverns technically specialize in wine while alehouses handle ale, this establishment leans toward the grape. But ale is what most people in this room drink in their daily lives, and it bears absolutely no resemblance to the beverage that word summons in the modern mind. Medieval ale contains no hops. Hops will not arrive in English brewing until the Renaissance. Instead, brewers flavor their ale with a mixture of herbs and spices called gruit, which includes yarrow, heather, juniper, and bog myrtle. The resulting drink is sweeter than anything a modern palate would recognize as ale or beer, so much sweeter that contemporaries called it liquid bread. That nickname functioned more literally than it sounds. Ale in the 14th century serves less as a recreational beverage and more as a daily caloric supplement. Estimates from surviving household records suggest consumption of up to a gallon per person per day across all social classes. When grain provides 65 to 70% of total caloric intake, and clean drinking water cannot be guaranteed, ale fills a nutritional and hydrological gap that nothing else can. One detail separates this ale from anything in modern experience more than any other. Ale in the 14th century is ready to drink within 24 hours of brewing, and it spoils within 2 to 3 days, a week at the absolute outside. Brewers were technically prohibited from selling ale less than 48 hours old, which means that a good ale was always a slightly older one, a batch that had survived at least 2 full days without souring. This is the origin of the term good stale ale, not stale as in flat and lifeless, but stale as in properly aged for the minimum required duration. The quality threshold was, quite literally, survival for 48 hours. The people who brewed most of this ale were women. They were called alewives, and they produced and sold the vast majority of ale consumed across medieval England. Brewing represented one of the few trades open to women in the period, and alewives developed their own distinctive visual marketing to attract customers. They wore tall, pointed hats to stand out above crowded market streets, and they placed broomsticks outside their doors to signal that their homes currently had ale for sale. If that image, a woman in a tall, pointed hat standing beside a broomstick, triggers a familiar association, it should. According to historians, the connection between alewives and the later cultural iconography of witches is not coincidental. These women became scapegoats for every vice associated with the ale trade. Contemporary records describe a trade filled with trickery, poor ale substituted for good, pint measures that ran deliberately short, inflated prices, and inebriated customers who discovered upon sobering that they had been robbed or cheated. For medieval authorities and moralists, it proved easy to link these deceptions with women. A 15th-century carving in St. Lawrence Church in Ludlow, England, depicts an alewife being thrown bodily into the fires of hell. In 1540, the city of Chester ordered that no woman between the ages of 14 and 40 could sell ale, explicitly restricting the trade to women outside the age of what was then considered sexual desirability. The profession that women had built and dominated for centuries was methodically stripped from them through regulation, moral condemnation, and cultural vilification. By 1600, the majority of brewers in London were men. The ale arrives at the table in an earthenware pitcher. It is shared, one pitcher, one drinking vessel passed from hand to hand around the table. That vessel is most likely a jack, a leather drinking cup waterproofed with pitch or beeswax, and every mouth at the table drinks from it in turn. The man sitting beside you, whose last bath may have been an event he cannot precisely date, presses his lips to the same rim you are about to use. There is no concept of individual servings. The ale has been assessed before sale by local quality officers called ale tasters, officials chosen annually in each manor's court and sworn to examine and judge every batch produced within their jurisdiction. If the ale fails inspection, the tavern keeper faces fines that can be substantial. A gallon of this ale costs roughly a full day's wages for an unskilled laborer, a figure that reveals just how much of a working person's income disappeared directly into their cup. If this documentary is deepening your understanding of how people actually lived in the medieval world, consider subscribing to this channel and sharing this with someone who appreciates history told without romantic distortion. These are the stories that primary sources preserve and popular culture forgets. Hunger follows thirst, and what passes for dinner in this tavern is where the evening turns from merely unpleasant to genuinely unsettling. Hanging above the central hearth fire is a large iron cauldron. That cauldron contains the evening meal. It is a perpetual stew, a pottage that has been simmering over this fire continuously for days, possibly weeks, conceivably longer. According to culinary historians, a pot of pottage in Perpignan was allegedly maintained as a perpetual stew from the 15th century all the way until the Second World War, when it finally ran dry during the German occupation of France. The mechanics are simple and, upon reflection, profoundly alarming. The cauldron stays on the fire around the clock. When a patron wants a bowl, the tavern keeper ladles some out. When the level drops, new ingredients are added: a hare one day, a hen the next, salted pork the day after. The flavor profile shifts perpetually because the contents shift perpetually. The cauldron is rarely emptied entirely, the main exception being the meatless weeks of Lent, when religious observation forces a temporary reset. What a patron consumes in any given bowl is a broth whose oldest molecular components may predate their arrival in town by a considerable and essentially unknowable margin. The stew is not the only option. A typical tavern offered roasted meats alongside simpler fare: bread, cheese, herring, and bacon. A popular prepared dish was boucanade, a beef pottage enriched with herbs and parsley that appears in multiple English and French cooking manuscripts of the period. But whatever the meal, it arrives on a trencher, a thick rectangle of stale bread that functions as a plate. The diner eats with bare hands, reaching for whatever food sits closest on the table. A communal serving spoon might be available, but individual forks for personal use do not exist in this context. The trencher absorbs the grease and juices of the meal, and when the food is finished, the diner either eats the bread plate itself or discards it for collection by someone lower on the social hierarchy. That bread warrants its own examination. Bread in 1340 is nothing resembling the soft, uniform product of modern bakeries. Finely sifted white flour was reserved exclusively for the upper classes. As one descends the social ladder, bread grows coarser, darker, and heavier with bran, until the loaf sitting on a laborer's trencher possesses the density and general chewing resistance of a building material, which is precisely the quality that allows it to serve as dinnerware. Under the Assize of Bread and Ale, established around 1266 under King Henry III, and widely regarded as the first food regulation law in British history, bakers faced regular inspections and punishments for selling underweight or adulterated loaves. The punishments ranged across monetary fines, bread forfeitures, physical chastisement, and public humiliation designed to discourage fraud through shame. A London baker named William Chester was dragged physically from the Guildhall through Cheapside to Temple Bar so that his fellow bakers could witness his disgrace. In Southampton, according to civic records, most penalties for baking violations consisted of bread forfeitures, and the confiscated loaves were sent to the city's prisoners. Even the prison bread was punishment bread. These regulations existed because bakers cheated constantly and inventively. Civic authorities documented bakers caught adding sand, dust, excessive bran, and various other fillers to stretch limited grain supplies further than honest baking could achieve. During the Great Famine, when wheat prices tripled and communities starved, the incentive to adulterate bread intensified, to the point where what a customer received bore only a nominal relationship to what bread was supposed to contain. The tavern is not merely a place for eating and drinking. It is, in the explicit view of medieval authorities and moralists, a den of sin that encourages gaming alongside intoxication. The tavern in 1340 provides dice, cards, and tabletop games to its patrons as a matter of standard service. The most popular dice game in 14th century England is Hazard, an ancestor of modern craps that Geoffrey Chaucer would later reference in the Canterbury Tales. The rules are intricate, the stakes are real currency and real property, and the consequences of losing extend far beyond anything a modern gambling establishment would permit. Innkeepers routinely acted as bankers and pawnbrokers, holding a gambler's personal property, sometimes including his clothing, as collateral in exchange for money to continue playing. Men lost everything at these tables. Dicing was banned in numerous English towns precisely because of how completely and rapidly it could destroy a person in a single evening. The alleys between buildings hosted bowling-like games set up by tavern keepers, an arrangement that is, incidentally, the origin of the term bowling alley. Scattered throughout the room, musicians performed, fiddlers played, ballad singers delivered narrative songs, and minstrels sang stories that contemporary observers described as frequently of the grossest description. When the music paused, the drinking continued without interruption. And that combination, armed men, strong ale, gambling losses, and a small enclosed space, produced exactly the results that any student of human behavior would predict. According to surviving court records, there were many manslaughter cases arising from trips to the pub. Most men carried knives as standard personal equipment. Arguments between armed, intoxicated men escalated with devastating speed and ended in accidental or unintended deaths with a frequency that the judicial system could barely process. In late 13th century Abbeville, a customer involved in a tavern fight was chased from the premises, and his body surfaced in a nearby pond 7 days later. According to surviving records, nobody bothered to resolve the matter further. In 1298, a Thursday night argument between students in an Oxford High Street tavern escalated into a mass street brawl involving swords and battle-axes, a confrontation that spilled from the tavern into the surrounding streets and drew in combatants who had nothing to do with the original dispute. The tavern was not a safe space by any definition. It was a volatile enclosure of armed, intoxicated individuals with short life expectancies and nothing that resembled a modern framework for conflict resolution. Those life expectancies deserve direct examination, because the numbers strip away whatever romantic residue might still cling to the medieval tavern experience. According to demographic studies, 36% of men and 56% of women living in urban areas during this period died before reaching age 35. Only 9% of the general population reached age 60. An analysis of English ducal families, the elite nobility with access to the best food, shelter, and medical care that the 14th century could provide, found average life expectancies of just 24 years for men and 33 for women between 1330 and 1479. If even the dukes were dying at 24 on average, the laborer sitting across the table tonight, sharing a leather drinking mug, has already beaten significant actuarial odds simply by being alive for this evening. More than 1/3 of all infants born during the Middle Ages died before reaching age 5. Skeletal remains excavated from London cemeteries of the period revealed that the majority of interred individuals had died before reaching 45. The diseases stalking this population include dysentery, tuberculosis, arthritis, and likely influenza in various forms. The available medical response to any of these conditions involved bleeding, sweating, and induced vomiting, all predicated on the theory that the human body contained 4 humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, that needed to remain in equilibrium for health. If a patron fell ill in this tavern tonight, the most sophisticated medical intervention available would be the application of leeches. That was the upper end of treatment. Everything below it was worse. What the Black Death did to England when it arrived 8 years after this evening belongs among the most catastrophic demographic events in recorded history. Princess Joan of England died on her way to a wedding in Spain. The newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury perished shortly after his ordination. Neither royal blood nor ecclesiastical authority offered any protection. Society mustered almost no effective response except prayer, quarantine of the visibly sick, panicked flight from affected areas, and the identification of scapegoats onto whom the terror could be displaced. A contemporary chronicler wrote that the living were barely sufficient to bury the dead. But what happened to taverns in the aftermath of the plague constitutes one of the strangest and most counterintuitive developments in English social history. The survivors, suddenly fewer in number and surrounded by more available resources per capita, experienced measurable improvements in diet, income, and leisure. Scholars credit the Black Death with catalyzing the rise of English pub culture. Survivors consumed more and better quality ale. They ate more and better quality bread. Meat and dairy appeared in peasant diets with a regularity that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. Wages rose sharply from the 1340s through the following decades, as labor scarcity empowered workers to demand better compensation. With fewer people competing for resources and more sheep available per surviving household, fresh meat entered the common diet as a regular feature rather than a rare luxury. White bread, once the exclusive privilege of the upper classes, crept onto common tables as grain grew cheaper relative to wages. Ironically, peasants frequently abandoned the healthier rye and barley breads of their predecessors in favor of the less nutritious but more prestigious white flour. And the surplus barley went directly into brewing more ale. According to demographic studies, peasants in the late 14th century lived an estimated 5 to 7 years longer on average than their counterparts before the plague. A modest improvement in longevity purchased at the price of roughly 1.5 million dead. The tavern, which had been a space of rough survival and desperate entertainment, evolved into something closer to a social institution, as disposable income and leisure time expanded in the plague's economic aftermath. The social underside of the tavern operated according to its own economy. According to contemporary records, most of the barmaids working in taverns supplemented their income through prostitution. Patrons frequently paid their bills in kind rather than in coin, and tavern keepers regularly served as fences for goods of dubious provenance. The tavern functioned not merely as a drinking establishment but as an economic node where money, stolen property, sexual commerce, and ale all changed hands in the same smoke-choked room. The class structure of medieval England inscribed itself onto every aspect of tavern consumption, but nowhere more visibly than in the matter of spices. A pound of pepper in 14th century London cost more than 2 full days' wages for a skilled craftsman. A pound of cloves cost nearly 5 days' wages. A pound of saffron consumed an entire month's earnings. These spices had traveled such extraordinary distances along trade routes from Asia that most English consumers had no clear idea where they originated. According to contemporary accounts, many believed spices came from an earthly paradise thought to exist somewhere near India. Merchants adulterated them relentlessly, mixing cheaper herbs with expensive imports, sometimes padding products with ground nutshells, small stones, or plain dust. If a patron could afford spiced food in this tavern, that person was wealthy by any relevant standard. If that patron could also verify the spices were genuine, the achievement bordered on the miraculous. The evening draws toward its end. The fire has burned low in the central hearth, and the smoke has settled into a thick, eye-stinging haze that gives the room the visual character of a poorly ventilated cave. The stew in the cauldron has been ladled down to its deepest, oldest layers. The ale is losing its brief window of freshness. The dice are still rolling on a table in the corner, where a man who arrived wearing a coat now sits without one. A ballad singer delivers a final song whose lyrics would not survive modern content moderation on any platform. And somewhere outside, in the dark streets where pigs root through refuse and open sewage runs between buildings, the ordinary machinery of 14th century English life continues grinding forward toward a catastrophe that no one in this room can imagine. The people gathered in this tavern tonight have survived a famine so severe that cannibalism was documented, and a king went hungry. They have endured lives whose expected duration, even among the wealthiest families in the realm, sits in the mid-20s to early 30s. They eat from bread plates, drink from shared leather cups, and sleep on floors that have not been properly cleaned since the reign of the previous monarch. They carry knives, they gamble away their clothing, they treat illness with leeches and prayer. And in 8 years a plague will arrive and kill 4 out of every 10 of them, reshaping the economy, the diet, the social structure, and the very institution of the tavern in ways that will echo for centuries. The survivors of that plague will eat better, drink better, live a handful of years longer. The cost of that improvement will be measured in mass graves across every county in England. But tonight, in 1340, the cost has not yet come due. The stew is still simmering, the ale is still circulating, the dice game called hazard is still underway in the corner, and it remains, when considered against the full scope of what is approaching, the most appropriately named game in the entire history of human recreation. Every person in this room is living on borrowed time and does not know it. But that observation applies, with varying degrees of urgency, to any room full of people in any century. The difference is that in 1340, the margin of borrowed time was thinner than almost anywhere else in recorded history. The ale spoiled in 3 days, the floor had not been swept since the previous king sat on the throne, and the deadliest pandemic in human history was already moving westward across the continent, carried by fleas, by rats, by ships, and by the ordinary mechanics of human commerce toward a shoreline that had no idea what was coming. If this documentary changed the way you see the medieval world, subscribe to this channel for more investigations into the darkest and most forgotten chapters of human history. The past was not a simpler time, it was a harder one, and the proof lies in every bone, every chronicle, and every flaw that Erasmus refused to describe in full.